Hey, welcome back to Bookshelves. My name's Shelby, and this is a cozy little corner on the internet where we talk about all things reading, writing, and otherwise bookish. And today is a very exciting day. It is quarterly wrap-up day. So I am going to tell you all about the books that I read in Q2 of the year, April, May, and June. This was a really solid reading quarter. I picked up 17 books over the course of those 3 months. 5 of them were from the library. Always got to plug Libby. And the sort of breakdown of types of books in that list is 6 print, 8 audio, and 3 digital books. Besides using Libby, I do also have books on Audible. I occasionally pick up books on Everand. I've become a pretty avid Spotify audiobook reader, and I have a big, beautiful collection of physical TBR books as well. So I'm pretty well supplied, and I made great progress in a pretty wide range of genres. So let's go ahead and get into it. As always, if you would like to stay more up to date with what I'm reading and not just hear about it quarterly, you can follow me on Storygraph, where I review books that I'm reading as I finish them, and you can even follow along with how much progress I've made in any given day. So I love spying on what other people are reading. And if you're a Storygraph user, which is sort of a Goodreads alternative, I would love to get connected and see what you're reading and share what I'm loving too. Let's go ahead and start with sci-fi and fantasy books. This is really the bread and butter of what I read. And I think I got through 5 books in this quarter in this genre, so let me grab them. First on this list is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I did pick this up to read because the movie was coming out. It's a book that had been on my radar for a long time, and I think knowing that it was coming to theaters just really gave me the push that I needed to prioritize it. The premise behind Project Hail Mary is that it is a sci-fi novel following someone who wakes up in a spaceship, and we have sort of 2 different timelines that give us the story over the course of the book. The person has amnesia, and so they wake up and they don't know why they're there and what they're supposed to be doing. They even have to discover that they are in fact on a spaceship, and in that way we proceed in real time as they search the ship, acquire their old memories, try to figure out why they're on this spaceship and what they're supposed to do. And then those memories kind of interject as they start to come back to him. And so we also kind of learn about him, learn about the reason he had to come to space, and kind of what he's trying to do. I don't want to give you too much else. There are definitely some key plot hooks that I'm leaving out, but I do think that they could function as spoilers if you really aren't familiar with anything about the book or the movie. And they're fun to discover if you didn't know about them. So I'm going to leave it there. But what I will say is that this book is funny and approachable and really hopeful, which I loved. It's a pretty hard sci-fi book, I think is fair to say, in that it really is about the science in so many ways, but it's science that does feel digestible even for a non-scientific audience. And the heart and personalities that ground the story really kept me rooting for the main character the whole time. The other thing I'll say is that I do have pretty high standards for sci-fi written by men, because there is just such a long, icky history of incredibly misogynistic approaches to the genre. And I think that Andy Weir has done us all a great service by writing a really interesting book that does not gross me out in any way. So grateful to him for giving us all a sci-fi book that everyone can feel seen in and root for, and manages not to be as misogynistic as some of its peers, let's just say. So highly recommend. I'm definitely going to be picking up the other books that Andy has written. I think The Martian is another one that has a movie adaptation that I'm inclined to read. And this one got 5 stars from me. Next on my list is Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. This is the 3rd book in the Game of Thrones series. And this was such a treat to read. We, my husband and I, have been listening to the Game of Thrones books on audio for the last 2 years. We both love the show and watched it, as it was coming out when we were in school. And when we got married, we decided to go on our honeymoon in Iceland. And Iceland is where they filmed a lot of the show. So we decided to start listening to the audiobooks as we were road tripping across the Icelandic countryside. and really have loved the experience. If you are a fan of the Game of Thrones show, I think there is still a huge value add in reading the books. They are intriguing and really like additive to the experience of the show. I would say you get even more lore, even more politicking, so much tension, even if you think you know what's going to happen. And I would say that the first 2 seasons of the show were pretty faithful adaptations of the books, whereas this third book is where things start to diverge. The 3rd and 4th seasons of the show cover most of the plot of this book, but some characters are further along than that, and some characters are still kind of behind and catching up. If you are not familiar with Game of Thrones, it's a piece of epic fantasy that's highly lauded, very, very popular, and it follows a sort of war related to succession of the throne. And we've got dragons, we've got romance, we've got politicking galore. It's a multi-POV perspective, and we really do have people across the entire mythic world in this book. It is so enthralling. And what I will say about the ways that this diverges from the show is that the ending of this book is insane. And it is not in the show. I was gobsmacked by the ending of this book. So if you have read this book, I want to know what you thought. Leave a spoiler warning in the comments, but I am dying to talk to more people about how this book ends because it blew my mind. And overall, I find it very difficult to rate these books because I have so much like affinity for the show and the idea of the story, and then there's the actual text. And this book is 44 hours on audio. We took a full year to read it, so it's hard to also even like remember everything that was in the book, but I gave it 4.5 stars. I had a great time. I loved getting to see iconic scenes like the Red Wedding and the Royal Wedding that finally happened in this book, and I really just can't recommend it highly enough. Next on this list is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. I love Robert Jackson Bennett's other works. I've read 2 of the 3 Foundry Side books, for example, and really enjoyed them, and Tainted Cup has been so widely lauded. I picked it up and loved it. It was a 5-star read for me too. This story is a fantasy murder mystery book, I think is fair to say. It's got a very like Holmes and Watson dynamic between an older woman who is frankly a lunatic and her young assistant who is trying to like make his way in the world. This fantasy setting is so interesting and vivid. It's very much like the setting is like a character in the book. There are these really interesting sort of like magical plants that are used to make all of these different human adaptations and kind of infusions, like give people magical abilities functionally. And this is also a world that is plagued by leviathans, monsters in the sea that attack the shore. And so the society that has cropped up around that lives within various levels of like protective ringed walls, and those very closely associate with people's class. I had a blast with this book. I gave it 5 stars. I thought the world, as I said, was incredibly compelling. I thought that the relationship of our like murder and mystery investigators was really fun. And I know there's already a 2nd book out in this series, so I will definitely be picking that up and every book that follows. The last book in this category that I read was on audio, and that was Daughter of the Other World by Shauna Lawless. I love Shauna Lawless. I think she is probably like my author of 2026. I read her Gale Song Era 1 trilogy earlier this year and have not shut up about it since. This is the first book in Gale Song Era 2. So these books are set in medieval Ireland. Well, maybe medieval? It's like 1000 Ireland. I'm not sure what the name of that time period is. And it's about a period of time where there were very competing forces for control over Ireland. There's sort of the Celtic peoples and their mythology and culture who've been there. There is a strong Viking presence and like the presence of Norse gods and Norse culture. And then there's also kind of this like recent influx of like Norman French kind of conquerors happening, and the presence of the Catholic Church throughout the story. And so there is this very real, functionally historical fiction about this time in Ireland's real history. And then there's this added layer of fantasy elements because it imagines that the like mythological races of ancient Ireland are also kind of pulling the strings a little bit in this dynamic. So the Tuatha and the Fomorians are two mythic races of people who like ruled Ireland in the ancient past, and they are also kind of among the humans vying for power. This book series, Gaelsong Era 2, follows the children of the characters in Gaelsong Era 1. And I absolutely loved this book and getting to be back in this world. When I read the first trilogy, I had this real sense throughout the first book that we were like setting dominoes that were gonna fall later. And it was an enthralling story, but I could almost like see Shauna's hand setting things up. And so I was at just a slight remove, and it was like a 4.5 star read. And then the next two books were absolutely phenomenal, like 6 out of 5 stars. And I thought that was going to be my experience with this book, being the first of a new trilogy. I could really kind of feel her setting things up again. And then the last quarter of this book just like blew my mind. It moved so fast. It said, no, the story starts now, you know? And it was just absolutely phenomenal. So I gave this one 5 stars. And the second book in this new trilogy comes out this month, so I'm really buzzing to see that hit my audiobook shelf and get to pick it up. Okay, the next category is like lit fic, dystopian fic, pointed fic. I don't know exactly how to describe this, but I have 2 books in this category that I have Frankenstein together. And the first of those is Small Boat. This is a fictionalization of a real tragedy that happened just a few years ago. It is a very short piece of fiction. I think I listened to it on audio in the span of like 4 hours. And it is about the migrant crisis in France and England and the terrible loss of life that happens in the English Channel. So specifically, the real life event that happened is that a boat of migrants, there were more than 30 people on this boat, begins to capsize in the English Channel, calls emergency services for help. And over the span of this like terrible night, they call for help again and again and again. And the French functionally say, you're too close to English waters, call the English. And the English are like, we can't get to you fast enough, call the French. And there's just this like weird jurisdictional back and forth. There are a bunch of other problems that shake out over this series of hours that lead to everyone but 2 people dying in a terrible drowning accident. And so this is an incident that was picked up by the press, and there was an investigation. And so there's just a huge volume of records that were made public from these calls and from police interviews later. And this book kind of uses those records to imagine what it was like to be that French dispatcher who was ultimately investigated for sort of a dereliction of duty. The book is certainly like making you sit with this terrible thing that happened. And it's making you think a lot about sort of like who's in the wrong, like blame and responsibility. But it also has this way of like pointing the finger back at the reader and at all of us and saying like, we are all complicit in this kind of structural horror that has happened that creates this kind of set of circumstances that drives migrants to take such dangerous journeys that they then sometimes die on. It's a really, really powerful book, quite dark and upsetting at times. And I loved it. I thought there was so much about it that was incredibly resonant. I think living in the US right now, I felt a lot of like through lines for me and a lot of the like sort of ICE crisis that we're experiencing and the sort of like kidnapping of people off of our streets. Like there were real things that felt resonant to this story for me, even though I am not somebody who is living on either side of the English Channel and experiencing a migrant crisis of that particular nature. So I felt like it was very relevant to an American audience, even though it is sort of, I'll call it a European issue. And I really thought that there were lots of very poignant moments in the text. I was particularly struck by what I would call symptoms of vicarious trauma in how the dispatcher is depicted. And there's really never any explicit commentary about that. Like nobody ever uses the language vicarious trauma, but there are a lot of symptoms of that in this story that really struck me as somebody who does like trauma work. And the only other thing I'll add is that I loved this book, but I couldn't give it 5 stars. I think there were moments where I could feel that like the message was sort of going over my head. I needed like an English class or like a book club or something, I think, to talk about this book with other people and like really get the most out of it. So if you can, I would say buddy read this book so that you have somebody to like bounce your ideas off of. This next one is going to require a bit of a content warning. So this story does touch on grooming, child sexual abuse, domestic violence. And if those are themes that are not something you feel comfortable listening to right now, you can skip to the next section of this video. The chapters should be down below. Okay, the other book in this category is The Blueprint. And this, I believe, is a debut, which is crazy. But this is dystopian, kind of speculative fiction. It's set in a near future America with an alternative history. There's sort of a second civil war that occurs, and the winning side is functionally a modern contingent of the southern states. And so they kind of seek to reinstate slavery in a modern form. And in this world, Black women who are descended from slavery are sort of like, functionally trafficked via a lotto system to white men in this new government. And as young women are forced to bear their children, it's very Handmaid's Tale in that way. And then they like end their service period and get to go off and I believe can like only marry Black men. And like then their life begins, right? That's the basic premise. And so we follow one woman in this story who we follow her from her youth, from her girlhood, into her young adulthood, who is with one of the heads of this government. And she both understands the world around her and how messed up it is, and also would say that she is in love with the person she's been assigned to, but it is very much because of grooming. So that feeling that she has is very much related to the fact that she has been groomed by this person since she was a child. This book thematically is very much about reproductive labor and slavery. It's drawing clear themes from real American history and projecting them into a future in which people have fewer and fewer rights, and there is this sort of system in place. And that is a very compelling theme. But I think even more than that theme, what I was struck by was just how realistically and effectively and caringly the experience of grooming and child sexual abuse and then later domestic violence are all depicted in this book. I read this book not long after reading Who's Watching Shorty by Roshana Landfair, which is all about her experience being groomed and abused by R. Kelly. And it is like this author sat down and talked with her. She depicted scenes, ways of thinking, emotions, almost beat for beat, in a way that really mirrors how grooming in real life plays out. And it's in an entirely unique form, right? There's no R. Kelly in this book. It's in an entirely fictitious setting, even. But the depiction of that was so true to form and so powerfully rendered. And I just thought that was really phenomenal. So, this book came on my radar because people were comparing it to Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And those are just like crazy comps to throw out. And I really do think they are earned. It is a phenomenal book. And it's one that I gave 5 stars. I will say I follow Kaylin, the redhead academic who is doing dissertation research on reproductive labor in the context of slavery. She is a historian and a student of Black history at Yale. And listening to this book and then watching videos where she was talking about her dissertation research was really like a bit of a whoa moment. Like to imagine a very near future America where those issues are very like salient and present, and then to like hear her talking about this very real history was very striking. So, Kaylin, if you ever watch this video, I think you would like this book, or maybe you'd poke holes in it because you're more familiar with the real history. But I did like think of her, and it was just interesting to kind of get to have this book kind of in conversation with somebody who's really like a scholar of the issue. So if you read this book, I also recommend checking out some of her content to learn a little bit more about where this book is drawing on real history. Okay, next up is some nonfiction reading. The first of these books is The Missing Thread, A New History of the Ancient World Through the Women Who Shaped It by Daisy Dunn. And this was a really interesting read. Anyone who follows my writing content will know that I'm writing a Greek mythology retelling. And in order to do that, I have been really giving myself a crash course in the ancient world. I'm not a classicist by training. I have a very different background. And so I've been reading lots of ancient history like this recently. And I really enjoyed a lot of this book. I think the first third in particular were really well suited to why I came to the book and really delivered on what I was looking for. Lots of great stuff in here about what the lives of women in ancient Greece and some of the societies that predated even the ancient Greeks. And I loved that content. What I will say is that this book was more sweeping than I realized. The scope of it was a lot more to take on than just the ancient Greek world. There's many ancient societies depicted here, and there's a large section of this book dedicated to ancient Rome. I would say at least half of the book. And while I would feel wrong giving it a lower rating simply because it wasn't what I was looking for, which is kind of a me problem, I ultimately landed on 4 stars for this book because I really struggled to keep up with the section on ancient Rome. I'm obviously much less well versed in that civilization, and that meant that I was a much more like novice reader. I just really had a hard time following everything. There were so many names. There were so many through lines and moments in history I didn't know about. And I just think I needed more guideposts. So if a novice reader came to this, I think they would have a similar experience to me. And I do think that that is more of a like structural issue with the story, right? That there could have been more done to help keep the reader oriented to these like overwhelming and sweeping histories. So overall, I really enjoyed this book. I learned a lot and took tons and tons of notes, but I did find it at times overwhelming. And because of that, it's a 4-star read for me. The next book on this list is another one that deserves a content warning. This book involves discussion of sexual assault and specifically the use of drugs to incapacitate someone. If that is not something that you are up for listening to, that is okay. Take care of yourself. And you can use the chapter headings to move on to the next section of this video. What I do want to talk to you about is A Hymn to Life, Shame Must Change Sides by Giselle Pellicot. Oh my God, you guys, this book was wild. This is a survivor memoir about Giselle, who you may know about. She has been in the news for years. She is a French woman in her, I believe, late 70s, who discovered in the last 5 years or so that her husband had been drugging her with sleeping pills and muscle relaxers and then inviting men to their house to rape her. A horrifying story. I think it was the largest trial ever in France. There was something like 70 defendants, and there were more people they just couldn't identify and ultimately charge who came to her house. All of this was recorded, which is kind of this other whole horrifying element of the story. She thinks that she's going crazy before that she discovers what's happening. She's, falling asleep, can't remember things. She's going to get brain scans, right? And her mother had cancer when she was a child, so she's like convinced that she's dying. And then her husband gets caught upskirting somebody at a grocery store. And when he's arrested and his phone is confiscated, all of this horrifying, incriminating evidence of this much larger crime is discovered. And so, the police come to her right? This sort of incredible role reversal compared to what most survivors experience. The police come to her to report a crime. And she spends a lot of time in this book really grappling with like how public to be about what's happened to her. She's known now as a real sort of women's hero in France because she opened her trial to the public. But that was not something that she was inclined to do by instinct. She really kind of comes to that decision after a lot of consideration, and we get to sit with her on that journey to make that decision in this book. There is so much in this story. There's very painful things in this story, as you might expect. There's also lots of powerful sentiments in this story about, as she says, both her hymn to life, her commitment to persistence, to existence, to joyfully living, refusing to let this define her, if you will. And also the sentiment that she must change sides. She describes all of the people who call her a liar in the course of this story. And she's like, everything that happened to me is on photos, right? And videos. She has this incredible story where she's not even the one who reported the crime. The police reported it to her. And yet people accuse her of making it up. And so she really talks about like the effort that people put into making her feel ashamed for what happened to her, and how, as she puts it, shame must change sides. She really does such a good job of like imagining the forces that are much larger than just her case, and how shame is leveraged against survivors of all kinds. And if somebody in her circumstances that are sort of the most extreme can still be, treated as if they have something to be ashamed for, that, imagine somebody in a much less kind of widely renowned scenario, and how difficult and painful that experience must be for them. So it does such a great job talking about these issues, how they impacted herself, and also imagining all of the women in various related circumstances. And I appreciate that she kind of used that as a space to talk about experiences even beyond her own. What I wanted to offer about this book too is that it's told with a stunning kind of simplicity. There's like a bit of a remove. She's stoic isn't the right word, but dispassionate, perhaps. It's not a graphic story for all of its horrors, and it's not an overly wrought, particularly emotionally expressive story. And I think that is really powerful and an important reminder that how one might imagine grief and trauma is not necessarily how it will be conveyed by someone, right? But I suppose beyond that lesson, I want to name that it is this more like direct and restrained story. Because if you're someone who is interested in reading survivor memoir and you are really worried about the sort of emotional weight of that story, Giselle has written a story that feels digestible. Like she, in her reserve, has created a space where I think more people might be able to actually pick this book up than other books that I've picked up in this genre. So anyway, a phenomenal story, 5-star read. And if you're in a place to read it, I think there is so much that we all have to learn from Giselle, and I would highly recommend listening to this. It's also narrated by Emma Thompson. So read it on audio. It's great. That's the end of nonfiction. On to ancient literature. I read 2 ancient texts this spring. The first is The Iliad by Homer, translated by Emily Wilson. And I'm just buzzing to have finally read this. I learned so much from the introduction by Emily Wilson to this text. It is so long. The introduction is more than 100 pages. It's a significant portion of this book. And it offered me so much context into the story, kind of a peek behind the curtain into how classicists think about this book and what it tells us about ancient society. And it was just such a wealth of information that I'm grateful to have consumed. And then in terms of the text itself, I loved Emily Wilson's translation. She translates this in meter, which is how it would have originally been read and spoken aloud, which makes for an incredible listening experience. I did listen to this on audio. Audra McDonald is the audiobook narrator. Phenomenal. And I will say that the meter makes it really like enthralling. Like the rhythm, you don't want to stop listening. It's got this really delicious kind of momentum to it. And I shouldn't be surprised because we've been all obsessed with this text for like thousands of years. It wouldn't persist if it wasn't good. But I was so intimidated by this book for so long. And I found that when I picked it up and like finally committed to reading it, it was so funny. It was so melodramatic. It was so tragic. And there was so much beautiful nature imagery in it. Like there are metaphors about gory battlefield deaths that are made using the language of like fields of flowers and forests of trees and stuff. Like a really unexpectedly beautiful book. And I loved all of that. I was so delighted to enjoy it as much as I did. However, I did only make it through this book by like turning off my brain and kind of like glossing over the just whole sections of names and lineages and little tidbits that just are not actually relevant to the story, but they're a part of this sort of like Greek tradition. And because I had to like do that to make it through the book, I had to accept that like some amount of stuff I wasn't going to follow and that it didn't have to really matter. I couldn't give this 5 stars, so I gave it 4.5 stars. And I gotta say, if you are ever interested in the Iliad, do it. Pick it up, read it. I was so scared for so long, and I'm gonna re-listen to it because there's so much I want to get out of a second read. But now that I've read it, I can genuinely say that I love it, and I think it is absolutely worth approaching. Even in your own personal life, it doesn't have to be a school assignment. There's so much you can take from it just as a person with some earbuds in. Sorry, I didn't tell you what the Iliad is about. The Iliad is set during the Trojan War, which is a war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And it's set towards the end of the war at a period of time where there's massive conflict in the Greek camp. Achilles, the warrior of the Greeks, and Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks, are basically fighting about a girl who they stole from a sacked city. And so Achilles ragefully stops fighting and kind of leaves the Greeks to suffer at the hands of the Trojans without him. And the story kind of follows all of the fallout from that decision. That's the basic premise. I then picked up the Aeneid by Virgil, which was so interesting. So the Aeneid is very much in conversation with the whole epic cycle, I think it was like 7 or 9 texts in ancient Greece that told the full story of the Trojan War. The 2 full surviving texts that we have are the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Aeneid is written in ancient Rome and tries to tie the founding of Rome back to the Trojans and the gods by extension. And this book very much honors and mimics lots of things about Homeric poetry. This book was also really phenomenal, and it follows the journey of Aeneas, who is a cousin to the Trojan royal family who escapes during the War of Troy with a group of refugees and is seeking to found a new Troy somewhere in prophesied Italy. That city ultimately becomes Rome. And the Aeneid in many ways feels like the Odyssey. The Trojan refugees travel by boat across the land. They get to a place, they get kicked out. They take on many challenges, much like Odysseus does in his own search for home. But there are also so many elements of this being a Trojan character and this being after the war, but in the same area as the war, that gives us really great scenes. We get scenes with survivors from Troy who were enslaved and spread all across the region. We get to find out how they are in lots of really interesting ways. Aeneas falls in love with the Queen of Carthage, and that goes poorly. And that's where sort of this long-standing conflict between Rome and Carthage comes from. There's a big journey into the underworld, another kind of classic rite of passage in the ancient literature. I loved all of that. We also hear from Aeneas' perspective some recounting of the fall of Troy. So, if you've ever wondered about the Trojan horse, for example, that's in part discussed in the Odyssey. There's also references to that here in the Aeneid. What I I didn't like about this book is the second half. Once he actually gets to Italy and like has to fight a whole war to win the hand of the princess, like all of that, I did not have a good time. I just was confused and bored, and I hated that they were at war when they just had to flee a war. So that part really didn't jive for me, and I think I'm just much less familiar with figures of like Roman descent as opposed to the figures of Greek descent who were really centered in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So for that reason, I ultimately gave this book a 4-star rating, but I still had a blast. And if you are looking for more education by Emily Wilson, this is not translated by Emily Wilson because of course it's being translated from Latin, not Greek, but it does have an introduction by Emily Wilson. And that has been, again, like a very additive experience to just my ongoing learning about the ancient world and ancient cultures. Okay, let's mosey on to graphic novels and manga. I finally picked up Frieren this quarter, which is subtitled Beyond Journey's End. You might have seen that the anime for this is on Netflix. I got this from my nephew multiple years ago, and I've been telling him I would read it for ages. And I was very glad to finally pick it up. I will say I wanted to like this one more than I did. But the basic premise is that we are following an elf in like a classic high fantasy questing kind of world. And she and her adventuring party saved the world. That was a while ago. And she is going to live a much longer life than her more mortal peers. And so it's kind of about what happens after the journey, what happens after the adventure. It's about kind of mortality versus immortality and like how to live a meaningful life when your life is so much longer than everybody you know and love. We kind of see some of her adventuring compatriots towards the end of their lives as they age, and she kind of has to forge a new path. She takes on a new apprentice and is seeking to understand magic in its many forms across this world. So I enjoyed this. I think it's a great premise. There were lots of sweet moments throughout, but I found, and I don't know if this is a translation issue or if this is an accurate reflection of how it feels in the Japanese, but I really struggled with the dialogue in this book. At times it felt stilted, other times it felt like quite cheesy, and I find that if the dialogue doesn't work for me, I have a hard time buying into the characters, and if not, I'm not very invested in the characters, it's hard for me to be like really invested in the story. So for that reason, it was a 3.5-star read for me. I'm still interested in picking up a couple more because I think there's a world where I could acclimate to that and be okay with it. But for me, the biggest weakness in this book is the dialogue. Oh my gosh, I also read the first 2 books in the Lightfall series. I think the subtitle of this is like The Girl and the Galadrian, but these are super sweet and fun and whimsical adventure stories between a girl and a Galadrian, who is kind of like a mythic monster savior creature. And I will start by saying that I think that the art and the humor and kind of like heart of this story really reminds me of Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. So if you loved that show, I think you would love these books. It's a world where a long time ago, there was a big problem that was solved. And now that big problem is coming back to haunt them. So our main character has been entrusted with a very magical item. She's supposed to protect it, and it kind of gets stolen out from under her. And so she and this mythic being that everybody thought was dead go on an adventure to try to get that object back and to save the world. But she really struggles with anxiety and loneliness and a lack of self-confidence. And so her grappling with that anxiety and panic and fear is depicted really beautifully in these books. It has this sort of like black swirling tornado-y effect around her as it sort of constricts her with fear. And she learns in real time over the course of these books how to navigate that. And I just think that's such a beautiful thing to model for young readers while going on the adventure. Like, she goes on the adventure anyway, and she just has to learn how to grapple with this kind of inner demon while she's fighting big bad guys out in the world. And I just think that is so heartwarming. So book 1 got a 5-star rating from me. Book 2 got a 4.5 star. And I cannot wait to pick up the rest.
Galdurian.
Thank you. I've been told it's Galdurian, so pretend I said that this whole time. The last on my graphic novel and manga list is Garlic and the Witch. I told you all about Garlic and the Vampire last quarter. I loved Garlic and the Witch too. It's the sequel. These books are so precious and whimsical and silly. They're about a little bulb of garlic who's been personified and is very nervous. And in the first book, she has to go kind of stand up to a vampire that moved in next door. And in this book, her mom, her creator, the witch, is feeling really stressed and stretched thin. And so she has to go on an adventure to try to like be a better helper to her, all while realizing that she's about to grow up, specifically grow into a human, because it turns out she's gonna be a person, which I didn't expect. So anyways, this is just another very sweet story, and I just cannot recommend these books enough. They are easy reading, but genuinely like so heartwarming, very like chicken noodle soup for the soul. Just one book left to tell you about, and that is in the children's literature section. I finished The Chronicles of Narnia. As I talked about in Q1, my husband and I have been reading children's literature together before bed, which is so much fun. You know, stories that he knows, stories that I know, kind of getting to share those and revisit them as grown-ups. And I had actually never read any of the Chronicles of Narnia books. I had just known and absolutely loved The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movie. And I have to say, the latter half of this book, big letdown. We read Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Silver Chair, and The Last Battle, and they got progressively worse ratings from me: 3 stars, 2.5 stars, and then 2 stars. I really did not like how this series ended. It made me angry. But what else to say? I think in particular, the plots became less and less plotty in a lot of ways. Like the last book definitely had a plot I could follow, even though I thought it was bizarre. But the Silver Chair, really, I was like, what is going on all of the time? I also feel like the allegory that kind of made C.S. Lewis so famous and popular in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and kind of conceiving of Aslan the lion as God, really just like I couldn't follow in a lot of the other books in this series. Like I couldn't even make out what sort of moral story we were supposed to be getting. And I just found that really frustrating. So I think I'm glad to have read all of Narnia and to know this story for myself as a grown-up in its totality. But I would say that the series as a whole is very mediocre. And really the only books in the series that I loved was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So it's helpful to have that context, and I probably won't pick them up again unless, you know, I'm sharing them with a child of my own one day. But I'm glad I know. And if any of you have read Narnia to the end, please, for the love of God, tell me what you thought of the ending. Because it made me so grumpy. So if you want to chat about it more in the comments, I would love to hear your thoughts. Just make sure you leave like a little spoiler warning at the top so that you don't spoil it for anyone else. Okay, that is the end of this very long reading wrap up. It's everything I read this spring. Don't forget to let me know down below what you read in the last quarter. What were your highs, your lows? If you've read anything that was on my list, what did you think? I'm dying for all of your bookish thoughts here. And I'm excited to see you all soon in another video. Bye.